Hi. So this is going to be the one lecture for both weeks. We're going to do something a little bit different this time. Instead of going through the process of me slowly writing the code and building it up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a completed app. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to explain the important bits. You'll see that there's a lot of new stuff. This one's going to be in TypeScript. And then what you're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks is you're going to start working on your own apps, which will be the second project. So the first project will be the code that we wrote for the first few weeks. The second project is going to be your version of this app. What this app is going to do is it's going to retrieve data from the internet. That's going to be the big difference. And I'll walk you through how to set this up and everything. The code is available to you in the course GitHub repo. There's a folder called Prep. Inside Prep, there's a project called Movie Browser, and that is the app that is this app that I'm going to walk you through. You'll notice a couple things about it. It's a little different, and this will be the first one written in TypeScript instead of JavaScript. TypeScript is basically JavaScript, just we also have type definition and things like that. So you'll see how things change and what the differences are as we walk through the app. So, hi, welcome. We're going to start with the README file. This is just, hey, download these things. So, just to be clear, the way that this is set up is that you've got the npx create expo. This is to actually create and you know what? I'll divide this. And install this. So, the npx create expo app we've spoken of before. This just create a basic expo app, and then you name it whatever you want. Don't necessarily name it movie browser, and then use the template expo template blank TypeScript. So this is just the blank TypeScript template. It'll get the basic stuff, and then open the project folder that it will have created, and you can run the install, and then you install this bunch of stuff. It's a lot of stuff, I know. And actually, there's one more thing here, that when you run it for the first time, when you run the web for the first time, it'll say, hey, you might end up missing a few packages. It'll say, hey, please run this command to install these last few packages. And then once you install those, you'll be able to run the web version of this, and you might get the same issue for like Android or whatever else it is. Don't worry about that. If Expo just tells you, hey, please install these packages, then go ahead and install them. It'll be a clear message in the console. So let's start by talking about what it is that I built and what it is that what you are going to be building. So in this case, we're going to do npm run web, because I just want to run the web one. You'll notice something a little different than before. This is actually loading a .env file, and it's doing some environmental export. I will explain all that jazz in a minute. This is my app. I can search for movies, so if I type Looper, not a great movie, but just the first thing that came to mind. I've got this, and I can click add to favorites, and then we can look up, let's say, Superman. And we can go through Superman 2025. I'm going to add that to my favorites. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to click the little faves button, and now I open the favorite screen, and I've got Looper and Superman are stored in my favorites. And obviously these would be stored even if I close the app and reopen it, these would still be stored. That's the app. That's all we're building. It's as we know, it's pretty simple. The important note here, though, is that these are actually being pulled not from nowhere, but these are being pulled from an online source. So the source that I'm getting these from is the omdbapi.com. Just request the API key, and you can do the free 1,000 daily limit. Just put in the request form here, submit it, and they'll email you an API key that you can use. I'm not going to show you mine because mine is still active, but this is just a basic, a cool little database for movies. Now, what are we actually building? So that's what we're building. How do we actually build it? So I'm gonna walk you through. You'll see there's a lot of folders here. We're always gonna have the same basic structure. We're gonna have a source folder. We're gonna have a couple of different things inside the source folder. Depending on the project, it's gonna be some things different. We've got an env file, which I'm not opening up because that env file is going to store my personal API key, which I can't easily change, so I'm not showing it to you, and you should not be showing it to other people. Appconfig.js. So here's where we start. This is something we got to keep in mind. So the app config, what this does is Expo automatically loads this data in, and we're giving Expo some basic details about, like, hey, this is the name of the app, this is the slug, but most importantly, the extra, hey, I need you to load in this process.env, use process.env, right? You import.env/config. So it's using the .env package, and then it's saying, hey, process.env.omdb API key. So it's actually going to read the env at compile time. So when it builds the app, it reads in this API key and uses it. Where does it use it? In source API, and this is where I'm going to start talking a little bit about what we got going on. So in source API, omdb.ts. So these are where I keep my API calls and my functions that make API calls, right? So in this case, I've got one, it's just called fetch movies. I give it a query string, and I also have, I'm importing constants from Expo constants, which we should have, see that, npm install, install Expo const, Expo constants, right? And that is just a built-in thing that loads. That is how Expo is going to handle constants for us. So instead of using process.env inside the app, I use the built-in constants because the environment is built up. Expo config extra omdb API key, which is being loaded up over here. So it's Expo, right? The Expo config extra omdb API key. That's where the name of it comes from. What does this actually do? It says, hey, if there's no query, just return empty results. Otherwise, if there is a query, we do response equals await fetch. Fetch is a built-in method for retrieving data. And we're literally just doing a basic get from a URL, right? And we know what a get is, we know what a set is. We've written the back end for things like this before, and we'll talk about more elaborate fetch requests as things go on. But a very basic fetch request is, here's the URL, so API key, I pass in my API key, and then query, and I pass in my query. And I'm going to get the results, which is just await response.json, which converts which gets the JSON part of a response. And then it's either going to be data.search, which will be the response field for that request. And if I don't have that, then it's just going to give me back a empty array. So there's two ways to get an empty array, either if there's no query that went in, or if no results came back. Other than that, it will give me back an array of my movies, and that's what I'm going to be looking at. So that's how we retrieve it. Another thing you'll note is this query : string. So here's where we start actually defining data types. So in this particular case, we're saying the query is going to be of type string. And this is what TypeScript is. This is how TypeScript works. This is the big thing of TypeScript, is actually define what the data type of arguments are, and that makes things a lot smoother. As we go on, you'll see it in more depth. Because I have to declare types, I want to have some custom types. So for example, I've got this interface, which is a movie, right? And a movie is going to have an IMDb ID, which is a string, a title, which is a string, a year, which is a string, and a poster, which is a string, which is actually the URL link for the poster. So if we want to add some more details to our movie, we would need to add them to this type 2, right? So if we looked at the requests, if we looked at the actual OMDB API, we can see that they might give us more details than we're displaying here. But we are just getting these few pieces of information. We're declaring the movie. Where do we use this type? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so that's the basics of what's new is we're fetching data, and we're dealing with types. So I've got the string type over here, and I've also got my movie interface data type over there. Moving right along. What is next? Okay. Okay, good. We've been recording. So we've got 3 screens, right? And we know what our screens are. We've got one context and I've got one component. So I'm going to start this by talking about my app.tsx. So the other thing you'll notice is that all of my files are now .ts or .tsx. TSX. I'm never going to pronounce that correctly again, so just TSX. We're good. I've said it once. Everyone's happy. And so I've got my TypeScript and my TypeScript expanded, or my TSX, which is that TypeScript with that fun React stuff built into it. So this is a lot of what we've seen before, right? So if I'm gonna hide but not close my console so that I can display full screen, but at the same time the app itself is still running. So so the app itself is still running. Okay. Excuse me. We are loading in a lot of stuff. I'm not going to talk in detail about what we're loading in. You will, if you're not sure what they are, you can look at them in detail. At this point, you know how to read an import statement, and you understand the difference between like the @react versus the /, which is the source for us, right? And then I'm getting my buttons from React Native, etc., etc. You're familiar with this stuff. You're familiar with the navigation, which is what this app does. The one thing that's different is we've got this favorites provider thing. And if you look at where favorites provider is coming from, you'll see favorites provider is coming from source.context.favorites.context. What is a context? So we've spoken about context kind of a lot we've spoken about context every now and then before, right? Where it's my specific I always exist in a context. It's like, hey, where am I? What is going on in my app? What's happening? Where am I, like in the terminal or somewhere else, right? That's your context of where you are. In this case, what we're doing is we're preserving the favorites by loading everything else inside of this favorites component. So I've got a context, which is one of my folders over here is a context, and that has the favorites provider, right? It's called favorites context, but the component that comes out of it is called the favorites provider. So let's take a look at that. What is it? So first is I've got a type. Remember, we're dealing with TypeScript now, so we're going to have some type declarations. So we're importing the type of movie. So wherever I say, hey, favorites is actually a type of, is an array of movies. What is a movie? We have the movie definition in types. The reason why movie is in a type in its folder by itself, but favorite context type is over here. It's because favorite context type is only used for this folder, for this file, whereas movie is used in several different places. And because it's used in several different places, we need to share it, so we have it as a separate type. That is a architectural decision. You can decide with your app which types do I want to declare inside specific components and which types do I want to declare outside in general. Now, so I've got my type declaration. My type has got favorites, add favorite, and remove favorite. Notice how this is like a full object type, which is different from just a interface. An interface is just going to have some data fields, whereas a full object type is going to have functions declared, right? In this case, we've got add favorite and remove favorite, and add favorite and remove favorite are actually actually function declarations, right? This is the syntax of a function. This is not an actual function. This is declaring that this data type is going to be a function, which will take in a movie and will return void, or will take in an ID and return void. So we're not just declaring. So when we're doing our type declaration, we're actually declaring a type of we're declaring the type of function. Now we've got favorites context. Create context is coming from React. What is a context? A context is a big concept in React. A context, in short, is just a... Oh God, this is not the right way to look at this. Really quickly, a React context is... A React context is how the app keeps track of specific states between components, is the short version. But those are like a lot of very specific words. So, passing data deeply with the context. So basically the idea is that we want to pass data pretty intensely between different components. And so one way of doing it is by passing the data directly. One of the ways of doing it is by handing the data The other way of doing it is by using a context which will keep track of things for us. You will see how we use the context here, and I recommend you do further reading of this page, which is just passing data deeper with context. It's part of Learn React. It's part of react.dev/learn. And you can, you know what, I'm going to include this. I'm going to include a link to this page in the README file for this project. So, additional links. And as we come across additional stuff that I don't have time in this video to fully explain, I'm going to leave links here for you to use. But in the short version is a context is, as you can see, it's something that we're wrapping everything else in, and it is a way for us to keep track of specific details in between different components in a easier manner than the alternative. The alternative is one that I'm not going to explain in depth. That is for your React class. That is like for a more in-depth React class, where you're going to start learning about passing props and things, which is something we're going to do a little bit today. Just a second. So we have the context, and then we have, and then the other thing we have aside from a context is my favorites provider, and I've got a function of use favorites. So my favorites provider takes in children. Children are a object type called children, which takes in a React node. So basically, my favorites provider is a React component that has child React nodes. It's got useState, and useState, this is probably the most complex useState we've seen, right? Which is we're going to have favorites and set favorites, which that is something we are used to. That is something that we've seen a dozen times at this point, right? useState. Except this time what I'm doing is this is the type declaration. So because useState is a function that is generic, right, which is something that we haven't thought about because we haven't really thought about data types like this for JavaScript. But if you think about it, the same useState function that we use for an array, we use for a string, and we use for an integer, and we use for a Boolean, right? And that's what we did last project. So this project, we're saying, no. In the way that we told React which type this particular state was by when we did the initial useState, we would pass something in. So in this case, we're not just passing something in, but because this is TypeScript, we actually declare the type inside of here. So inside here, we have these greater than, less than, almost like a tag. Excuse me, but this is not a tag. This is the generic syntax. So you've got an array of movies, and it's starting as an empty array, right? And that's what this favorites variable is. So now I've got a function called add favorite, and I've got a function called remove favorite. And those are all part of the favorites context type. So my add favorite and my remove favorite are two functions. What does the add favorite do? It takes in the movie, right? And it says, hey, set add favorites previous.find m.imdb equals imdb. If we find the movie there, then we just keep our favorites as is. But if we do not find the movie, right? So we're looking for the movie by IMDb ID. If we find the movie there, then our favorites stay the same, right? If you're trying to add a favorite for a movie that already exists, we don't do anything. But if we don't have it, then what we do is we do the spreader for the previous, which is all my favorites up until now, and we add the new movie to my favorites. That's what it does. Both of these are using the set favorite function, right? Which is the state of my movies, right? The state of my favorites. Because all this whole thing is about keeping track of the movies that are in favorites. So when you add a favorite, I look at the list. Is something in the list already? No, great. I add it and then remove it. I do the inverse, right? I say, hey, is something in the list? We say, hey, is something in the list already? Yes. Great, we're going to remove it. How are we removing it? We're using the filter function on the array. So previous, so set state, we take in the previous state and we return the new state. So in this case, I'm taking the previous and previous filter. We're creating a filter. We're saying, hey, all movies whose IMDb ID does not equal the ID I was just given. So I'm removing the ID I was given and I'm keeping everything else. And then since this is a function, we return the function context provider, value of favorites, add favorite, remove favorite, and children. So this nice little provider is still a React component, and because it's a React component, it's a .tsx, and it returns all of the children in the TSX. Now you notice here we've also got one more function. We've got this use favorites function. This use favorites function says, hey, context, use the context of my favorites context. If there's no context, throw an error. Use favorites must be within favorites provider. Otherwise, you return the context. So use favorites is an additional function, and that allows us to use this favorites context. So we get to create and pass around my context throughout. What does that actually look like in practice? Well, in my app, it means that I pass the favorites provider. I wrap my entire app in the favorites provider so that everything inside of it is related to this context. Now, aside from that, what else have I got? I've got my navigation container, which is something we've done before, right? We've created a stack navigation, got my navigation container, and then I've got my stack.navigator, got my stack.screen, right? I've got my home screen. My home screen is going to be the component home, and we're going to pass some navigation to it, right? Which is, hey, as part of the options, I'm passing in navigation, which is a header right, is going to have a button for favorites. When you press it, it's going to go to favorites, right? And then I've got a second stack.screen, which is details, and I've got a stack.screen, which is favorites. So I've got 3 screens that I can go in between, and we're going to look at each of them. We've got the details screen, the home screen, and the favorite screen. Going to close everything we've opened so far. We're going to start looking at our screens. We're going to start with our home screen. Our home screen, remember that our home screen looks like this, right? So at the end of it, our home screen is just a app that looks like this, right? And then we've got my favorite screen, no favorites yet, and I've got my details screen. So if I look at junk, all right, let's say junk mail, this is my details screen. So I've got 3 screens. Looking at my home screen first, right, which is this screen, which as I search for, right, like, I don't know, fast. The Fast and the Furious, and it starts showing, you know, all the different movies in that one. As I start looking through as I do a search in my home screen, I get some details here. So we've got 2 states. We've got 2 states for this app. We've got movies and we've got state. And we've got query. Query is going to be my search string, and my movies are going to be my flat list details of the movies. Those are 2 things I've got. Excuse me. So, use effect. Use effect, we know what that does. That just loads up the data right away. And this is going to be const load async set movies. So this is if there's a query at the start, we are going to use the effect to load our movies. Other than that is, as the query changes, you'll see that we are going to on text change set query, right? And when we set the query, we're going to use the effect to reload our movies. So I've got a view, right? Which I've got some very basic style here. I've got a view. Inside the view, I've got a text input, and I've got a flat list. Now, an important point to highlight here is that whenever we write React components, everything needs to be inside of a single tag. Now, what happens if my style dictates that I need multiple tags at the top? Then what you do is you just create literally an empty tag like this. So right now I'm getting an error because this is 1 level up, but technically what we would do is we would just do something like that. And so sometimes in React you'll see this initial empty tag thing. And we use that to ensure that everything is being returned. We're returning our function returns a single object, even though it's going to have multiple tags with multiple nodes and multiple details and a bunch of other stuff. Sometimes we literally just use an empty tag to not an empty tag is in an unnamed tag, an anonymous tag, and we wrap everything else in it so that we can have multiple components and they're still there. Now, my text input has a style, has a placeholder of search movies, has a value for query, has on change text set query. And then the other thing I've got is I've got my flat, right? So what happens is whenever we change my query, we set the query, and then when we set the query, we use the effect of, hey, the query changed, so we're going to reload my movies, and we're going to set my movies. What do my movies get set to? My movies get set to whatever the value is of fetch, whatever the result is from fetch movies, which if you remember, fetch movies comes from my API file, right, which is literally just getting the movies. Now, fetch movies. Now, the flat list is the other thing that I'm doing, right? And so over here, I've got my data, which is my movies, which is going to be an array of type movie. And now you can see that this is actually much easier to follow with TypeScript than it was with React, because my IDE is smart enough to understand TypeScript and knows, hey, this movies is of type array of movies, so it tells me immediately, yeah, you're getting a type of movie. You're getting an array of movies, and if I click over here, I can actually look at exactly what data is in a movie. So if I'm looking at someone else's code and there's a lot of stuff going on, having TypeScript is actually easier to follow than JavaScript, because I know the type declarations, assuming that they do proper type declaration, but I've got it there. So remember, we've got key extractor. Key extractor is every item needs an ID. How are we getting the ID this time? We're using the IMDb ID. And then we're rendering the item. Render item is going to be a function. It takes in the item. And now we're doing something different, something that we have not done before, but is something that is common in React. We are using a movie card. Movie card is not special. What's special about it is that it is a component. So you see over here, I've got components. Movie card is a component. We're passing in the movie as an item, and we're passing in an onPress navigate to details with the movie that we're passing in. So, what does that mean? Well, let's look at what movie card is. Movie card is its own component, right? So this is another React component. Notice how technically screens and components are not different, but the reason why we're organizing them differently is because of what they're used for. So in our case, the movie card is just a component. It is never actually its own page, but it is used in other pages, whereas my home screen and my favorite screen and my detail screen, those are all separate screens that we actually are full pages. So if you were doing this in a React component that was built primarily for the web, then you might call this these pages instead of screens. That's a difference in syntax, but the idea is components are pieces that get used inside of larger components, right? Which in this case is screens, and those screens are all used in the navigation components, and that's what React is, right? It's just about loading and unloading a bunch of these separate components. So, my movie card. My movie card is it's going to take in a movie, it's going to take in an onPress. And now we're saying, hey, like we're actually taking in some data here. And the type of this is movie is going to be of type movie, and onPress is going to be a function that returns void. Now, touchable opacity, that is a component from React Native that makes the view respond properly to touches. So if we press down, the opacity of the wrapped will decrease, right? It'll make it lighter or darker because, like sometimes when you tap something, it'll like adjust it. So that's what touchable opacity is. It is just a component that makes us do that. We still need the actual onPress function. So onPress is like onTap, but in this case, onPress is, hey, when someone selects this, they're going to run a function. So if we go back to my home screen, in this case, they're going to run a function which just navigates them to the details page and passes in the movie. And the details page is just the details page. So to explain that in like practice, right? So if I click this, the opacity changes, and then when I let go of my click, this is the details page for this particular movie. And it's not that every movie has its own details page. It is that the details component takes in the movie as an argument. So if we go back over here, you see that when I'm doing onPress, when I tap it, I do onPress. And if we go back to home, we're saying, hey, onPress, I need you to navigate to the details component, right? And how do we know the name of the details component? If we go back to the app, my stack screen, right? My stack navigator has a name of details for this details screen. So I'm passing in, hey, navigation.navigate, and the navigator knows, oh yeah, you've given me my navigator, right? My navigation is like, oh yeah, it passes in the navigator, and it says detail. The word details means I go to the details screen. So we're going to details, and we're giving it this data, which is the label of movie and the type of item. Not the type of item, the data of item. An item is just the item from the flat list. My movie card, right? And then I've just got the image, which is source URI movie.poster, right? So movie.poster is how I'm getting all these images. If we inspect the image, you'll see that the source is this file, right? This URL, which is just the URL that the API gives us, and then we do styles.poster, which is just the CSS styles that we set for our poster, which is just a dedicated width, height, margin right, and a small border radius. And then my view has got text, and my text is just going to be the title and the movie.year. So we've got the title and the year of the movie, and if I wanted to add more details about the movie to display on the main screen, all I'd have to do is I would have to just add them over here for the movie card, but then I would also need to go to my detail screen, because if you guys remember, the home screen has the navigate to details, so the detail screen is what actually displays the movie by itself. And we're over here with the add to favorites page. This is displaying the detail screen, which is an entirely separate component from the movie card. In theory, we could write the movie card to actually display both, but the detail screen is so simple that, and we're not displaying multiple movies on it, so we're just going to leave the detail screen by itself. In this case, the detail screen is going to take in a movie, right? So route any, and it takes in a movie, and it has my favorites, right? It's using favorites. Where does use favorites come from? Use favorites comes from the favorites context, right? Which is that function in the context, which basically says, hey, we're using this context, and we're going to keep it, and from that context, we're grabbing favorites, add favorite, and remove favorite. How does that work? How does it work here? So I've got a basic view, I've got an image, right, which is the movie poster, again, slightly bigger based on the styling. And then I've got my text style, which is just the movie title, and then I've got my year, which is the year of the movie. And again, if I want to add more details about the movie, I would add them. If we wanted to just add more details on the detail page about the movie, we would add it here, but we can't just add it here. We also need to make sure that my movie type preserves those variables. So I would add them in here as well. And we might do that demo as part of class next week to add like the director and the writer as part of our movie details page. Then we've got that button, and it's the same button, right? It's the add and remove, and you notice how it's just changing state. What is it change state based on? It's just title is fave, right? So is fave is just a very simple function. Favorites.sum IMDb m.imdb equals movie.imdb IMDb ID. So this is just saying, hey, in my favorites, does this ID exist? Right? .sum is just saying, hey, does at least one thing in this list have it? If this condition is true for any item in a list, any item in the array, then this condition is true. If this condition is not true for any item in the array, then this condition is false. But it's just .sum is, hey, is this true for one thing? If it is, awesome, great, then this is going to be true. So is this movie a favorite? So is it in your favorites? Yes, that's true. So then we're going to say, hey, remove from your favorites. If we remove from favorites, then we're going to add to favorites. Using the same logic, on press is going to say, hey, is this movie in your favorites? If it is, you remove it. If it's not, add it. Just based off of, and notice how remove favorites just takes in the IMDb ID, whereas add favorites takes in the whole movie, because when I'm adding to the array, I need everything. When I'm removing from the array, I just need the ID of the array to remove. And then, once again, I've got styles. So that's my detail screen, and that is my home screen. And the way I get between my home and detail screen is I select a specific movie. Now, from anywhere, right, because I created this from my home screen, where I created this additional context, I have this little fave button, right? Back in my app, I'm giving a little bit of additional thing. I'm giving some navigation of header right. So as part of the navigation, header right, we're saying, hey, put a button there, right? Put a button that when you press the button navigates to favorites, which is the only way we're getting to favorites. And if I click on faves, I have no favorites yet, but this is how I get to favorites. So what does my favorites screen do? So I've got my favorites context, and then I've got my favorite screen. My favorite screen is going to grab my use favorites from my favorites context, And then all that this does is it creates a, hey, do we have any favorites? If we do, if we don't, right, if the length of favorites is 0, then we say no favorites yet. If, however, some favorites exist, then we say no problem, here's a list of all your favorites. And then once again, if you click on a specific movie, we're going to render them with the movie card, and if you click on one, we're going to go to the details page of that particular movie. So to show you what that looks like, we're going to just add the Fast and the Furious to my favorites, and now I'm going to go into faves. Now you see the Fast and Furious is listed here, and if I click on it, it's the details page again, and I can remove from favorites. And if I go back to from details, I'm going back to favorites, and then from favorites, I'm going back to home. Remember about the whole navigational stack thing, right? So here I'm going into just the details page. So from this, if I go back, I'm going back to home. I'm just going to a few more so you see what it looks like. And then if we go into favorites, you see how I've got a couple, but now I'm in the details page, details from favorites. So if I go back from details, I go into favorites, and then from favorites, I go back to home. So that is what we mean by navigational stack. Okay, I think that covers my entire app, right? We've gone through we've spoken about the context. And this is like a really important detail about like what a context is and how it works. It is basically a way to preserve this data, because you can see that all my different screens are using my use favorites, which is, hey, I need to use this context. And when they use the favorites, what does that function do? It loads the context into... It loads the context, right? Which is my favorites context, which is declared right here, which is of the type favorites, and it gets all the definitional stuff over here, which is the favorites provider is the definition for the favorites context, and that is where we get all of my fun details. Excuse me. And then I can use favorites, and I can access the specific functions in the favorites, such as in my detail screen, right, such as my favorites, such as my add and remove favorite, which we get from my detail screen. So the other thing to recognize here is like how interwoven the navigation of this app is, right? This is a really simple app with technically just 3 little screens and 1 component, but I've actually got like 5 different ways to get to something, right? Because I can get to the details page from the favorite screen or from the home screen. So that might seem like that gives the illusion technically that there are more details, that there are more screens than there are actually. And we end up, when we start dealing with navigation, when you start thinking about navigation, it's very natural to think, oh yeah, I just go from this page to that page. But just because I'm going from this page to that page does not mean I need to build a third page. Right? Does not always mean I need to build a second page. Very often we end up doing like we're doing here, which is instead of building a separate page, my page itself is being I'm just passing different data in, and the navigation and everything else makes it look like it's a different page, or makes it feel like a different page, right? When I go back, I'm going back twice to get back to home from the details instead of just going back once. But the reality is it's the same thing, and it's kind of important to like think about that a little bit and to like understand what it is that we are doing here. So I will upload this code. Remember, this is going to be just to show you. So for the class, this is the class folder. Inside of that, there's the prep folder. Inside of that, there's movie browser. And this is the app that we've been working on so far today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. As I said, like we didn't have class this week, and this lecture is for this week and like this past week and this coming week because of Thanksgiving and because of other holidays. Hence the missing class. But this should give you a very good idea of TypeScript and like passing between apps in this particular app. And what I want you to do is I want you to start, and we're going to go. I want you to take a look at that details about context. And we're going to learn about context, and we're also going to learn about Redux. In the next lecture, I may record a short video, but more likely I will give the lecture on Redux when we are back together in person. In the meantime, start building your own version of this app, which is basically you can copy this whole thing, but replace where you're getting the data from and replace the data you're getting. And obviously play a little bit with your styles on how you're displaying it, but don't worry too much about the styling part of it. In the meantime, have a great Thanksgiving. Enjoy the week, and I will see you in 2 weeks.